We now have another keynote speaker. Very pleased to be able to introduce Daniel Malan, Assistant Professor in Business Ethics at the Trinity Business School at Trinity College Dublin. He is former Associate Professor in Ethics and Governance and Director of the Centre for Corporate Governance in Africa at the University of Stellenbosch Business School in South Africa, as well as a former visiting scholar at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. His focus areas are business ethics, corporate governance, and corporate responsibility. He is the co-chair of the B20 Task Force on Integrity and Compliance, a member of the Global Future Council on Transparency and Anti-Corruption of the World Economic Forum, a member of the International Corporate Governance Network's Disclosure and Transparency Committee, and the regional partner for Africa at the International Centre for Corporate Governance in St. Gallen, Switzerland. He has consulted to the World Economic Forum, United Nations, International Finance Corporation, as well as various large corporations, and has worked in 41 countries. Daniel, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks very much to GTNF for the invitation to speak to you today. The talk will be about 15 minutes, and after that, hopefully we'll have time for some good discussion. The topic of my talk today is based on a report that has recently been released, Contradictions and Conflicts, looking at state ownership of tobacco companies and the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the FCTC. Now, we know that the FCTC has been in force since 2005 and seeks to protect present and future generations from the devastating health, social, environmental, and economic consequences of tobacco consumption and exposure by addressing issues such as advertising, promotion, sponsorship, as well as illicit trade. While the purpose of the FCTC is laudable, I'm sure you'll agree, I think the impact can be questioned. 2019, the WHO reported that since 2000, overall global tobacco use fell from 1.397 billion to 1.337 billion. Responding to these numbers, the Director of Health Promotion at the WHO said the following, and I quote, "Reductions in global tobacco use demonstrate that when governments introduce and strengthen their comprehensive evidence-based actions, they can protect the well-being of their citizens and communities." End quote. While the WHO seems to be happy with a decline of less than 0.25 percentage point per year over almost 2 decades, I think it is rather disappointing. One reason for this poor performance may be due to the fact that nearly 50% of the global cigarette industry is controlled by 8 governments who are also signatories to the FCTC. These countries are China, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Thailand, Tunisia, and Vietnam. Of course, the number is heavily skewed by China National Tobacco Corporation, the biggest tobacco company in the world by some distance, with 44% of the global combustible cigarette market. However, there are 18 countries in the world where governments own 10% or more of at least one tobacco company. And of these 18 countries, 17 are signatories to the FCTC, with Malawi being the only exception. How is it possible that the WHO, which does not allow private sector representatives of the tobacco industry to attend its meetings or even set foot inside its offices, can accommodate these interests? My focus areas are ethics and governance, and in this recently released report, Contradictions and Conflicts, I address the question from these angles, and I'm delighted to share with you today some of the key findings of the report. The message is simple. There's a contradiction within the FCTC itself, and there's a classical conflict of interest situation in the case of governments who own tobacco interests but are also parties to the FCTC. The contradiction is an issue of logic in terms of the design of the FCTC. Article 5.3 of the FCTC clearly states the following, and I quote, "In setting and implementing their public health policies with respect to tobacco control, parties shall act to protect these policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry in accordance with national law." Article 5.3 makes a very clear distinction between the party to the FCTC on the one side and the commercial and vested interests of the tobacco industry on the other. The intention is to protect the one from the other, and it seems impossible that this wording could make provision for an overlap between the two. In other words, a party to the FCTC that also has commercial and vested interests in the tobacco industry. However, the implementation guidelines for Article 5.3, that's 7.2, state the following, and I quote, "Parties with a state-owned tobacco industry should ensure that any investment in the tobacco industry does not prevent them from fully implementing the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control." This flawed logic is an example of the classical fallacy called circulus in demonstrandum, a circular argument. Article 5.3 requires parties to protect their policies against the commercial and vested interests of the tobacco industry. But if a party also has a commercial and vested interest in the form of a state-owned tobacco industry, Guideline 7.2 requires that party to fully implement the FCTC. But to fully implement the FCTC, such a party must protect its policies against the commercial and vested interests of the tobacco industry as required by 5.3, which means that it cannot have an investment in tobacco. I think the WHO must be aware of this contradiction, but it tries to manage it by pretending that it's not a contradiction. And this spills over, perhaps inadvertently, in the way in which the WHO treats the large tobacco companies. For example, in its 2019 report on the global tobacco epidemic, the WHO does not mention China National Tobacco Corporation even once. Yet there are more than 20 references to companies such as Philip Morris International and British American Tobacco. As a result of this contradiction, the governments that are involved operate within a conflict of interests. On the one hand, they have committed themselves to fight the tobacco industry, but on the other hand, they are part of and benefit from the tobacco industry. This is an issue of ethics, not legality. It is not unlawful to sign a convention that requires you to oppose something that you also support, but it is unethical. Imagine an international convention against drug trafficking that allows some organs of state to have a stake in the activities that it tries to prevent. The possible future pathways for governments with state-owned tobacco interests are all complex and involve dilemmas. It should be emphasized that all governments have tobacco control responsibilities, whether they own tobacco companies or not. These broader responsibilities were not addressed in the report, but will ultimately have a huge impact in terms of tobacco control. If governments can be convinced to support the idea of the tobacco endgame, any of the potential pathways could have benefits. 3 of these pathways are described as status quo, get out, and shift gear. Let's look at status quo first. In order to maintain the status quo with confidence, governments will have to be convinced that their current position is justified, both financially and ethically. They will have to be comfortable with the FCTC contradiction of being part of the problem that they are supposed to address. Outdated models of firewalls would have to be maintained, such as the idea that it's possible for different government departments, for example, public health and public enterprises, to operate independently and not to interfere with one another. This approach runs contrary to global trends in terms of integrated thinking and integrated reporting. The second option is get out. In terms of this pathway, governments will accept that it is not appropriate for them to have vested interests in the tobacco industry. They will therefore privatize the interests and continue to simply regulate the tobacco industry without the burden of conflicts of interest. The immediate risk involved in this pathway is the potential unintended consequence that tobacco companies, once privatized, might perform better. And that is a global trend. Usually when companies are privatized, they perform better in terms of traditional financial measures. And in the case of tobacco, that will have the unintended consequence that more harm will therefore be caused. The final option is to shift gear. This is potentially the most pragmatic option. It entails an acknowledgement of the existing conflicts of interest, but a commitment to manage them. Being transparent about conflicts and managing them rather than avoiding them altogether is an acceptable strategy in terms of sound governance. It allows governments as owners to make decisions that do not have to take short-term financial performance into account. It can potentially help to transform the industry by being more innovative, for example, by focusing on reduced harm products, while implementing more traditional tobacco control policies and interventions at the same time. A harm reduction provides one interesting option available to governments. The choice isn't between everything or nothing. At the time when the FCTC was launched, harm reduction was an underdeveloped area, with nicotine patches and snus being the main options. Today, there are many more electronic nicotine delivery devices, such as e-cigarettes, available, and research estimates these products can reduce the harm associated with smoking cigarettes by up to 95%. Of course, much more research is required in this area, but one big advantage of any state-owned enterprise is that governments are not constrained by the short-term expectations of greedy shareholders. They can therefore afford to take a long-term view and make decisions that take the public good into account. Although it seems counterintuitive with reference to tobacco, in general, state-owned enterprises have the potential to be more closely aligned with benefit corporations or non-profit organizations than with traditional transnational corporations. As we move forward with this research, one of the interesting parallels to investigate would be state-owned alcohol interests, something that is not uncommon, for example, in many Nordic countries. Angela Pratt from the WHO had an interesting response to this comparison, and I quote, "There is an important difference between alcohol and tobacco. Current debates about products such as e-cigarettes aside, there is no harm reduction discussion to be had about tobacco per se. And therefore, there is no conversation to be had with the tobacco industry, state-owned or otherwise, about harm reduction." I find this a very strange argument indeed. It is similar to criticizing the fast food industry in the following way. We know that the fast food industry is doing important work on more healthful options on their menus, but if we leave that aside, they are doing absolutely nothing to address health issues. There is no one-size-fits-all option. The existence of different pathways individual government will make decisions that are theirs, also be discussed and agreed with their most important stakeholders, including other investors, consumers, lobby groups, and industry associations. Both the FCTC and the implementation guidelines make provision for amendments. And I may be naive, but I think it would be worthwhile to pursue such amendments. One interesting historical example to look at would be the initiative of the Global Citizenship Commission, which was chaired by former UK Prime Minister and UN Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown. The Commission revisited the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70 years after its adoption and investigated the continuing relevance of the Declaration in the 21st century. In the words of Gordon Brown, and I quote, "We understood we were asked about a new, far more integrated and interdependent than when the Declaration was signed." And it is the subtitle of the Commission's report that is particularly pertinent for us today, when they refer to the Declaration as a living document in a changing world. If these words could be used to describe the FCTC, tobacco control will advance in leaps and bounds. In conclusion, the tobacco industry is a tainted industry with a poor track record. Whatever the reasons might have been for governments to own a stake in the industry, their ownership makes them complicit. Opportunities abound to transform the industry, and governments will have to play a central part in this process. Rethinking their own ownership of tobacco companies will be an important first step. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's very interesting. It's an area that doesn't perhaps get discussed enough. We've got a couple of questions here. I might throw in one or two of my own. But we have a question saying, congratulations, Daniel, for shining spotlights on a vital and ignored area. With Smoore now the largest e-cig company by market size, and China starting to invest in tobacco harm reduction, is it likely we will see them embrace tobacco harm reduction as they have embraced ending the internal combustion engine and now lead the world on that? Could ending combustion in cigs be next?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think that certainly, although this report didn't focus in depth on harm reduction, it seems to be gaining ground all around the world, including China. The things that when governments or companies for that matter make decisions in terms of their strategy and where to go, they always take well, they're supposed to take the moral case and the business case into account. And what seems to be happening clearly in terms of the uptake is that that there is a very strong business case also for harm reduction, in addition to the benefits that it would have in terms of being a pathways for smoking cessation, for example, which would have ethical components. So to me, it's not surprising that we also see major moves in China in terms of harm reduction and e-cigarettes.
And if I can just ask you a question, is your main concern here that the countries that have a sort of nationalized or semi-nationalized tobacco industry not bringing in enough anti-smoking policies, or is it that they are clamping down on reduced risk products? Because we see in the map that you showed there, places like Japan banned e-cigarettes altogether, possibly because they don't want to see fewer smokers. On the other hand, you see a country like Thailand, which actually has been at the forefront of anti-smoking policies, particularly in Asia. So in that particular instance, it seems that having 100% ownership of the tobacco industry hasn't put off the government from trying to really clamp down on smokers. But my question is, what's the main concern here? That they're not anti-smoking enough, or they're not pro-tobacco harm reduction?
Well, I think the main concern in terms of my research has been that they are conflicted. So they are required in terms of, and here we're talking specifically about the FCTC parties. They are required, because they are a party to the FCTC, to regulate in such a way, once again, vested commercial interest of the tobacco. At the same time, they're also making profits, and they're profiting from the industry. And now, if you have to make the decision, how do you do that in terms of public health, and you rely to such an extent, especially in the cases where there are state monopolies, on making money on top of that, sort of getting corporate taxes as well on tobacco, it puts them in a very difficult position. So that, I would say, is a separate argument to the one, do you also get involved in harm reduction? And that's why I think the pragmatic approach of shifting gear would be the most appropriate one, because it would allow companies to exit from tobacco or combustible cigarettes without sort of a big bang privatizing that could have the opposite effect, but at the same time focusing on public health issues, taking it seriously, and focusing on harm reduction.
Could one not argue that every government, every country has a conflict of interest here? Because even if they don't own part of the tobacco industry, they get an enormous amount of tax revenue from tobacco duty. I mean, here in the UK, I'm pretty sure the government makes a larger profit on the sale of cigarettes than the tobacco industry does. If you go over to the United States, where you've got the master settlement agreement, states are very conflicted in that they will lose significant amounts of money if people start giving up smoking in very large numbers. So in a sense, everybody's conflicted here, aren't they?
I would agree. But at that level, the situation would be similar also with other industries, like energy or alcohol or transport. But the major conflict here, and the point that you raised is mentioned in the report. Everybody has that responsibility, every government, and yes, you're never going to get away from the reliance to some extent on taxes. But on top of that, to actually own the company and be responsible for its commercial success and trying to increase those profits and then benefiting from the tax makes it much more serious. And perhaps just to add to that, one of the things that could be investigated, I'm not an economist, so I haven't looked at this in any detail, but if at least in some cases you could see sort of dedicated application or spending of the taxes earned through tobacco in terms of public health, that would also signal some commitment from governments where they earn those revenues.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions, both about Malawi, so we'll perhaps take them at the same time. The question asking, what percentage of the tobacco company does the Malawi government own in their country? And another question saying, in a country like Malawi, which is highly dependent on the tobacco sector for a large portion of the GDP, what's the responsibility of the developed world to assist in the transition away from tobacco?
Well, the first part of the question is 42% is the ownership in the tobacco company in Malawi. Of course, Malawi, as I mentioned, is the only country that of the 18 included in the research that is not a party to the FCTC. And it's a big question to ask. The responsibility of the developed world, because that would bring into play sort of a lot of ideological debates about developed and developing world and the global north and south. We know that in Malawi specifically, agriculture is important. So there are many small scale farmers that depend for their livelihood on tobacco, and I know that there are already a huge priority to assist farmers who are by default involved in the tobacco industry because they farm tobacco, to transition to other crops that would still give them an income and a livelihood, but would remove them from the tobacco industry.
All right. We've got another question here. This is perhaps a philosophical one, but in terms of ethics, where do you see the difference between state lotteries and state tobacco ownership?
Well, state lotteries don't kill people when you buy a lottery ticket. I know some other people have also compared state lotteries to gambling, but I really don't see any direct link between the two. I think lotteries have perhaps their own problems in terms of people spending too much money when they can't afford it to try and win the lottery. But as long as there is transparency on income and expenditure, and people can see exactly where the money, the revenue earned from lotteries are applied, and that it's applied to the common good, I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see how the regulation does change when the state is directly involved. I mean, you can buy a lottery ticket or a scratch card in Britain at the age of 16. You can't do any other gambling until you're 18. And I suspect that has something to do with the fact that the government runs a lottery, and perhaps there are parallels there with the way some governments have been over-regulating or banning e-cigarettes, whether it's because they own the tobacco industry and e-cigarettes are a direct threat to them, or simply because e-cigarettes, generally speaking, are not taxed at the same rate as tobacco. So even in a country like Britain, which is quite pro tobacco harm reduction, the government is seeing a big loss in revenue, and it's not likely to make that up with e-cigarette revenue. I've got one more question about Malawi. I think it is Malawi receives 60% of Forex from tobacco. The issue is different versus other countries. Their investment is on leaf tobacco. The new president 2 weeks ago announced that transforming out of tobacco was a priority. Few donors, though, have provided needed support. This is a massive priority for government. It's more of a comment, I guess, than a question. We have one other question now. I think then it'd probably be time to go to a break. If the World Health Organization is to shift gear, does its performance over COVID-19 provide an opportunity to apply pressure for change? And if yes, how best to do? So a big question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think that has given us many opportunities to rethink. And what I also mentioned in the report, in the conclusion, is specific reference to the World Economic Forum's Great Reset initiative. This idea that we have now entered a time in our history where all of a sudden it became clear that we can actually make large adjustments over a short period of time if the need is really there, and it gives us time to revisit some of the rules of the game. So what the World Economic Forum, for example, recommends is that we need to look at things like fair regulation. When there are economic stimulus packages, they should be allocated according to very clear economic, social, and governance metrics, and also that given the fourth industrial revolution and the technology that part of also result in the development of all these new devices that we have, all of those things should really be part of the debate. And that brings me back to the reference also to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, where we acknowledge this is a new context. We are not saying that you should scrap everything that was done before, but there is a need to relook at and reinterpret some of the conventions, some of the ways of doing things that we've had in the past, and that would include the FCTC.
Yes, I would agree with that. Well, thank you very much indeed. That was a really interesting presentation, very interesting subject. We're now going to take a break until 35 minutes past the hour. So it'd be 9:35 in the UK, 10:35 in most of Western Europe. So everybody, please feel free. Go to the engagement rooms, go to the networking rooms. You can speak to some of the other guests and indeed some of the speakers. And we will be back in about 20 minutes for a panel on innovations on the horizon. And we shall see you then. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Daniel.
Thank you.